Welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about, well, the most astonishing thing, which is that the Ice Age never happened. Now, I've made some fairly wild claims over the years, but in particular, the idea of an Ice Age is based on what, scientists are going to say is irrefutable evidence. But what we're going to see is that the evidence isn't quite as irrefutable as people believe, because when you look at what the evidence really is, there is a more cogent explanation for that evidence. And at the heart of that evidence, we're going to begin with this creature, this mammoth known as the Berezovka mammoth. Now, I first came across the story of the Berezovka mammoth when I came across the Adam and Eve story itself. And the Adam and Eve story, if you're not familiar, was published by this gentleman named Chan Thomas. And it was published back in the early 1960s. But in any case, when the book was published, one of the things that occurred was that the CIA, who got a copy of it, classified it. And everybody lost their shit and said, hey, why are they classifying a copy of this book? And the answer to the question is that it is an example of, of the apocalypse being found very early on. So I want to start with the story of the Berezovka mammoth. And I'm gonna hit it at a high level here really quick from the Google AI review. And it says the Berezovka mammoth is a famous well-preserved mammoth carcass discovered in Siberia in 1900. Found frozen and upright with undigested food in its mouth, it remains a scientific mystery. And while there are lots of parts about the Chan Thomas story which, aren't necessarily supported, including the idea of cyclical apocalypse or cataclysms, the thing that I like about it is that it takes this one very specific piece and it says, look, the freezing of our planet didn't happen slowly. It happened super fast. It happened in a process that it calls super prodigious, which means really, really fast. And in fact, Chan lays out the story like this, and I'm going to read this because it's worth hearing as an introduction to why the Ice Age didn't happen the way we think it is, as a very solid foundation. So first of all, it goes like this. The story of the frozen mammoths is intriguing indeed. No frozen mammoth has ever been found in ice. All were found frozen in homogeneous muck. That means they were all found in mud. They didn't just fall through the ice in a lake. They were in the midst of a flood of mud, and that flood of mud water, of muck, froze them. It used to be that you could buy frozen mammoth steaks in Alaskan restaurants. The meat had been so well preserved by quick freezing in the muck after the mammoth's drowning and suffocating to death that it was then maintained that the frozen status was there for almost 7,000 years. So Chan Thomas himself actually agrees with the general timing that I proposed, which is that things are really only, since the apocalypse, about 6,000 or 7,000 years old, maybe even less. It may be as little as 2 or 3, but it's definitely not 10,000 years ago. 6,000, 5,000, maybe 4,000 BC. Chan Thomas even agrees with that. Let's keep going. Perhaps the most noted of the thousands found thusly is the Berezovka mammoth, found near the Berezovka River in northern Siberia. Like all mammoths found wherein, some comment was made concerning the skull. It was noted that his skull was pink from hemorrhaging in the head, plus the fact that he had a penile erection, both of these facts being evidence sufficient to prove that he suffocated to death in the surrounding homogeneous muck. Further, he was frozen so fast and kept frozen for almost 7,000 years, during which his erection was kept on frozen record constantly until he was found. So one of the things that happens when people die and when animals die, and what the point he's making here, is that the adrenaline rolling through the system can cause the erection to occur in a dying animal. And in this case, what he's saying is that not only was this animal so, stimulated that it had an erection, but it froze so quickly that the erection itself was frozen in place. And that's a stunning piece of note. So he goes on to explain, how fast that would have had to have occurred. So let's go back and watch this real quick. The Berezovka mammoth was found about 1900, and more scientific data was gathered and recorded about this animal than any other such frozen behemoth. It's true that this beast has also initiated more scientific controversy than any other such find. To my way of thinking, one man's work stands far above all other. One man's work stands far above all others. Ivan T. Sanderson, the biologist. He approached the problem from a frozen food viewpoint, and he was the only one to do so. This is his story. When you freeze meat, the problem is to freeze it fast enough so that the moisture contained in the meat does not have time to form into large crystals while freezing. The faster you freeze, the smaller the crystals. If you freeze meat too slowly, the moisture will form crystals large enough to destroy the fibrous structure of the meat. When defrosted, the meat will be nothing more than a mass of goo, unfit to cook or eat. The larger the piece of meat to be frozen, the more difficult it is to freeze it fast enough to avoid the formation of the destructive moisture crystals. For heat must be removed at the same rate from, say, half a steer as from half a pound of ground meat. It would be the same problem if you had to freeze a bucket or a tub of water in the same time it takes to freeze a thimbleful. So what he's saying is that, look, if you take a small thing of water in a thimble and you put it in the freezer, right, in order to not form large crystals, the thimble's small enough, it'll freeze in minutes. But how do you take the carcass of a woolly mammoth and get it to freeze that fast as well? And he really goes into it here when he talks about how fast that freezing must have happened. Now, a mammoth weighs up to 5 tons. Those mammoths found in Siberia were somewhat smaller, but still several ton animals. When the Berezovka mammoth was dissected by Russian scientists in 1901, they recorded that even the innermost lining of the beast's stomach had a perfectly preserved fibrous structure, indicating that his body heat had been removed by some super prodigious process in nature. So the word prodigious means remarkably or impressively. Super prodigious means super remarkably, super impressively. I mean, what he's saying here is it happened in an extraordinarily quick time that this beast was frozen. Sanderson, taking special notice of this one point, took the problem to the American Frozen Food Institute. What does it take to freeze an entire mammoth so that the moisture content of even the innermost parts of his body, even to the inner lining of his stomach, do not have enough time to form crystals large enough to destroy the meat's fibrous structure? The Institute really attacked this problem. To freeze a quarter or a half steer presented a big enough problem. But a whole mammoth? Some weeks later, the Institute went back to Sanderson with the answer. It's utterly impossible. With all of our scientific and engineering knowledge, there is absolutely no known way to remove the body heat from a carcass as big as a mammoth fast enough to freeze it without large moisture crystals forming in the meat. Furthermore, after exhausting the scientific and engineering techniques, they looked to nature and concluded that there is no known process in nature which could accomplish the feat. So many have loosely claimed that the Berezovka mammoth, quote, fell into a crevice or fell into the ice or some other nonsense. There is absolutely, positively, irrevocably no explanation in the known process of nature to explain the quick freezing of the Berezovka mammoth, concurrently with the muck in which he was suffocated and drowned. I mean, what they're saying, and you can always look at it this way and go, well, Bob, this is 1901. Maybe this is a little bit later than 1901 when they took it to the Institute. And yeah, back then they go, we can't think of any way that we would suck the cold out this fast. But their final conclusion is what it takes. The Institute did tell Sanderson what it takes to do the job, however. First of all, the body temperature of the mammoth must be lowered about 140 degrees Fahrenheit 78 degrees centigrade from its normal temperature. And it must be accomplished in an absolute outside time limit of approximately 4 hours. Actually, they concluded, the freezing process would have to take place in an elapsed time of closer to 2 hours. Now, I want you to imagine that you have this giant beast, this multi-ton beast, and it froze inside out. According to them, it would have had to have happened in less than 4 hours. In fact, not only would it have had to happen in less than 4 hours, it would have had to happen closer to 2 hours. That, my friends, is the definition of super prodigious freezing. Things freezing almost instantly. And so when we talk about what it would take to do this, you have to have a massive discharge removing the heat. And so that's what we're looking at when we talk about the apocalypse and the discharge that ionized Venus. One of the things that people don't quite grasp is how hot the surface of Venus is. And the question, where did all the heat come from? And the answer is that in the apocalypse, when the discharge happened and split the Red Sea, the heat exited through the divide in the crust at the Red Sea. Where did the heat come from? And the answer is the heat had to have come from the entire globe. And in particular, as the heat exited near the equator, it pulled it from the two poles of the planet, freezing them permanently. And that's why when we look at the poles, what we're looking at isn't necessarily the buildup of ice over thousands and millions of years. What we are looking at is we're looking at the flow of energy from the poles to the Red Sea. And that pole sucked energy down at the poles. And these are the layers that created the ice cores. And so when we look, for example, at the evidence for the Younger Dryas event, the Younger Dryas event isn't showing us the layering of ice over thousands and millions of years. It's showing the ice as it was deposited during the apocalypse and the final discharge. And so here we are. We have a super prodigious freezing event, and we have physical evidence of freezing occurring in hours. And so here we have our first piece of evidence that the Ice Age not only didn't occur, but the onset of a frozen pole, of our poles being frozen, occurred quite literally overnight. And when we begin with this piece of information that, look, Bob, there was an Ice Age. Well, I mean, we can argue that there was a moment where the planet froze at the poles. That I can concur with. But the idea that we had glaciers, is that supported? What is the other evidence that they look at? And so for this next part, I went to Grok and I said, hey, Grok, tell me, what is it that scientists utilize in their determination that there was an Ice Age? And Grok gave me a couple of things in particular, but at the very top is glacial striations and scouring. I've done several videos on the geography of our world and shown that the geography of our world was formed by electricity, by electrical discharges. I've shown that the Mississippi River was formed by a positive electrical discharge. I showed that the Hudson Bay was formed by a negative electrical discharge. I've shown that not only was the Mediterranean itself formed in the apocalypse, but the entire western continent of Europe was formed by an electrical discharge that left a delta, a triangle shape in the entire area. I recently did a video on Alaska where I showed that Alaska not only has a circular ball center, but it has a circular shape across the entire state, and that the delta Y itself formed the Camacho Peninsula and Alaska. I showed that there are hystereses that formed the shape of the west coast of North America and the east coast of Asia. All of these are examples that the Earth was transformed, that it was sculpted by electrical forces and not by glacial striations. In fact, one of my favorite areas to talk about the formation of the geology and geography is right here in western Wisconsin and the St. Croix River Valley. Now, last year, it might have been this summer, but I think it was in the last year, I actually came across a paper being written by a student at Mankato State University. And this paper was about to be published. And so not only did this student's paper begin by saying, hey, I don't know what caused this, but I decided because of that I was going to send this off to I was going to send my findings off to the professor, who of course said, I'm not letting you talk to this kid because he is almost ready to publish this paper and you're just nuts. Right, I'm nuts. The kid says in his paper quite clearly, I don't know what formed the St. Croix River Valley. But of course, in order to get his degree, he's got to tell the guy that it had to do with glaciers. To which I told him, the professor in the paper, I defy you to find the rocks, the type of rocks that formed in, for example, in the Interstate Park area. I defy you to find these rocks downstream. They are only found in this one very specific part of the river. But, you know, it's academia and they're not going to listen to that. They're going to tell you that the St. Croix River Valley was formed by glaciers. It wasn't formed by glaciers. You can't get the 90-degree angle rocks that make up the area. In particular, rocks that move at a 90-degree angle straight up and have a right angle on them left to right. It's insane to say that these were formed by glaciers. Not only that, but they say that western Wisconsin was formed by glaciers. But you have the formation of the Baraboo Range, which is in central Wisconsin. And in the middle of the Baraboo Range, you have what's called Devil's Lake. Devil's Lake is a lake in the shape of an L. It is an endorheic lake. It's you know, a couple hundred feet up in the air, 300-400 feet up in the air on top of a mountain. And not only does no water flow into it from a river and no water flow out of it, but they have no idea how glaciers could have formed this when there is no evidence of glaciers pushing rock around it to begin with. And so what they don't realize is that an electrical discharge formed this entire area. They don't realize that the L that makes up Devil's Lake aligns straight east to the mouth of the river that feeds Niagara Falls. These are electrically linked segments of the circuit during the apocalypse. In fact, one of my earliest videos was on the electrical formation of the Great Lakes, something that I have gone on to do more and more work on. Not only are the Great Lakes formed by an electrical discharge and the vaporization of the surface, but the Great Lakes are responsible for the formation of the Thunderbird. The Thunderbird is the vaporization of the surface of the Earth, forming a cloud over the entire Midwest of what we now call North America. The wings of which were made up of a coronal loop because that was the electrical event that occurred over the eastern half of what we now call North America. Glaciers had nothing to do with it. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that things didn't get cold. Things got really cold. But there were no glaciers. They also talk about things like moraines and drum lines. You know, in Wisconsin, they have this thing called the Ice Age Trail. And it's a big trail that goes over the entire upper Midwest in the shape of an arc. This arc exists as the center of the torus that formed over the area. This is an arc not because glaciers came in and sculpted it. This is an arc because a discharge lifted the material away from it. The evidence that these things were not formed by glaciers is voluminous. They were formed in an electrical discharge. And so moraines and drumlines are not an example of glaciers. They're an example of electromagnetism. One of the ways to look at the apocalypse and to look at the evidence for things like the Mammoth is to have a more articulated understanding of what the Earth was like prior to the apocalypse. Now, I've talked about this before. The planets, Venus, Mars, and Earth, were in a row. It was Venus on the top, Earth in the middle, and Mars on the bottom. And Mars provided a stream of charged particles from the south at the Earth. This is why the mud core samples of Antarctica show that it was a luscious subtropical environment. This portion of the planet experienced the incoming positive electrical charge from Mars, causing a warming in the southern hemisphere of the planet. And in the northern part of the planet, we had a zone between that warming and the cold. And that was where these mammoth and, woolly bison and the woolly rhinoceros, that's where they lived. They lived in this temperate climate region north of the equator. So some might say, well, okay, Bob, if it was freezing up there, that was the Ice Age. There very well could have been ice on the cap of the planet during that time. However, mythology, religions, they all say the same thing. I mean, the Old Testament's very clear about this. The oceans boiled. Venus fell into the earth from the north. And because of that, were there to have been any ice in the northern portion of the planet, it would have been melted. There are no ice cores in the northern part of our planet that come from before the apocalypse. The oceans boiled. The ice that was here on the planet vaporized. And the ice that we have there today was pulled back down in supersonic layers. And they give us, in the oscillation that we see in the Younger Dryas hypothesis chart, they show us the oscillation of heat and cold as the planet Venus was coming to a slow stop from its impact. That's what we're looking at in the data. There was no ice age. There was an apocalypse, there was a freezing of the poles, and then there has probably been a slow thaw from that moment in time. In fact, somewhere along the way, there was a single major pulse. And it could be that large, thawings occurred at the poles, which were part of the cause of what we call the flood, the cataclysm, the Noah flood or the Utnapishtim flood. That very well could have occurred as a post factor. But the idea that there was a 3, 4, 5, or 10,000 year period where we had an ice age and glaciers carved the continents is malarkey. Total, complete malarkey. There was an onset in minutes, maybe hours. That onset lasted for an unknown number of years, but we know it wasn't that long because mankind was still here. And we emerged out of that period into the formation of the civilization that we see today. And that time frame, even amongst the Jewish calendar and the Chinese calendar, only puts us about 6,000 years ago. 7,000 at the most. And 7,000 years ago is what Chan Thomas says. So I hope this is a good way for you to begin as an introduction to why the Ice Age didn't happen. And it should be another example for you why Dr. Stinky McDougall's work is like no one else's. Don't forget to click that like, share, and subscribe button, and peace out.